What would you do if a dying prisoner, a disgraced priest, begged you to risk your job for his final wish? Father Thomas is haunted by a 25-year-old lie he told to protect his church. Now, he asks his nurse, Rebecca, to smuggle one final letter containing the truth. But the abandoned church it's meant for is scheduled for demolition. If you believe that the truth deserves to be heard, please like this video and subscribe so these stories of redemption can be shared. Stay with us because this is not a story about sin. It's the true story of what it costs to find peace. Once, in a quiet correctional facility tucked somewhere in Ohio, a letter changed everything. It was found inside an old, dusty Bible, its pages yellowed, its spine held together with tape. The letter was written by a prisoner, a man who used to stand behind an altar and speak about God's mercy. When the warden opened it, no one expected the words inside to shake an entire church to its core. This is not a story about crime, the narrator's voice begins softly. It's a story about faith, about forgiveness, and about a man who carried another person's sin for 25 years. The camera drifts through the narrow halls of the prison, the flicker of fluorescent lights painting the walls a cold blue. We hear the sound of a clock ticking, slow and steady, echoing like a heartbeat. Inside the infirmary, Father Thomas Kelly, 58 years old, sits alone at a metal table. His hands tremble as he writes the final lines of a letter addressed not to a judge, not to a friend, but to God. "Forgive me," he whispers, "not for heaven, but for peace." The pen slips from his fingers. He clutches his chest, gasping softly. Outside the room, a young nurse named Rebecca Martin rushes in, her sneakers squeaking on the floor. She calls for help, presses her hand to his shoulder, but the old man only looks up at her with tired eyes and says, "If you ever find mercy in your heart, help me send this letter." And just like that, the seed of tragedy is planted. Thomas Kelly wasn't always an inmate. Once, he was Father Thomas, the kind of man people trusted with their secrets. He led Sunday services at St. Ashford's Church, a small brick chapel in a working-class town. He baptized children, buried the dead, and spent his evenings delivering food to families who couldn't afford dinner. His sermons were never long. He believed God preferred honesty over eloquence. But 25 years ago, everything changed. Someone in his parish, a man of influence, committed an unspeakable act. And Thomas, out of misplaced faith and fear, stayed silent. When the truth surfaced, he took the blame to protect the church he loved. The papers called him the priest who lied for God. The community turned its back, and the church, the very place he'd devoted his life to, quietly let him fall. Now, behind steel bars, Thomas lives out his final years in the same rhythm every day, reading his worn-out Bible, tending a few plants near the infirmary window, and writing pieces of letters he never sends. He keeps mostly to himself, though the younger inmates sometimes stop by for advice or confession. They say he never preaches, he just listens. Rebecca, the nurse who tends to him, is 27. To her, he's not a priest or a criminal, just an old man with kind eyes and a failing heart. She works long shifts, rarely talks about her own life, but there's something in the way she lingers by his bedside that hints at respect, maybe even belief. On that particular evening, as the sky outside the barred window turns pale gold, Thomas folds the half-written letter and slips it into his Bible. He looks at Rebecca and smiles faintly. "You know," he says, "God forgives quicker than people do. But sometimes, it takes people to carry his forgiveness out into the world." She doesn't answer. She simply checks his pulse, scribbles something on her clipboard, and walks away. But his words stay with her. And somewhere deep inside that aging prison, beneath the hum of lights and the rhythm of iron doors closing, a story of redemption begins to breathe. Quiet, fragile, but alive. This is The Letter from God, a true story about forgiveness, faith, and the kind of peace a soul only finds when it finally tells the truth. Morning came slow in St. Ashford Correctional Facility, the kind of morning that smelled like bleach and metal, with a faint hum of machines in the distance. Inside the infirmary, the light hit the cracked floor tiles just right, turning everything the color of dust and silence. Rebecca Martin poured herself another cup of burnt coffee from the old pot near the nurse's desk. She'd been on duty since dawn. Her hair was tied back, her eyes rimmed with the kind of tired that comes from years of holding it all together. Most days, she didn't think too much. She just did her job, one patient at a time, one day after another. But ever since that night, since Father Thomas handed her the half-finished letter, something inside her had shifted. He didn't speak much after that. He'd sit by the window, hands folded, eyes following the sparrows that sometimes landed on the fence outside. The other inmates called him preacher, but Rebecca had started calling him Father, the way people did when they forgot why they stopped believing. "Did you finish your letter?" she asked softly one morning, setting down his medication. He smiled, slow and weary. Letters are never finished. They just wait for someone to send them. Rebecca didn't answer. She checked his blood pressure, wrote down the numbers, then lingered for a moment longer than usual. There was something in his voice, something that made her want to know more, though she wasn't sure why. Thomas had been in this prison longer than some guards had been alive. His story was whispered about, half forgotten, half judged. They said he was once the pride of St. Ashford Church, the man who held Sunday services for soldiers returning from war, for widows who couldn't stop crying, for children too small to understand what sin even meant. He ran a soup kitchen behind the church and never turned anyone away. Until the day the truth came out. A man from the congregation, wealthy, powerful, had done terrible things. And Father Thomas, believing he was protecting the church, had kept quiet. When the scandal broke, he took the blame. The bishop stayed silent. The papers shredded him. And overnight, the man who once preached mercy became the face of betrayal. Rebecca didn't days past after that night in the infirmary. The sound of metal doors opening and closing had become a rhythm of its own. And somewhere in between, Father Thomas and Rebecca began to share quiet moments no one else saw. He would ask her about her family. She would shrug and say there wasn't much to tell. She lived alone. Her mother was sick. Her father left when she was little. One evening, after she checked his blood pressure, he asked softly, "Do you believe in redemption, Rebecca?" She looked at him, uncertain how to answer. "I believe people can do good things," she said finally. He smiled, a tired kind of smile. That's not the same as being forgiven. He reached under his thin blanket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The same letter. The edges were frayed, as if his hands had trembled each time he touched it. "I need to send this," he said, "but not through the mail. I want it to rest where it all began." Rebecca frowned. "Where's that?" "St. Ashford's church, the one they closed years ago. It used to be God's house, before people forgot what he sounded like." She hesitated. "Father, you know I can't take anything out of here. It's against protocol." "I know," he whispered, "but I won't ask you again. I only want to die knowing that letter found its way back to him." There was silence between them, thick, almost holy. The hum of the fluorescent light filled the room, and she could feel her heart beating faster, though she didn't know why. That night, at home, Rebecca couldn't sleep. She sat by her small kitchen table, the one her mother had bought at a thrift store years ago, and stared at the half-empty bottle of medicine she could barely afford. The heater made a faint clicking sound. Everything felt heavy. She thought of the old man's words: forgiveness, redemption, peace. Words she used to hear in church as a child but stopped believing in when her life got too hard. The next morning, she returned to work early. Father Thomas was awake, reading his Bible with the letter tucked between the pages. She stood there for a while before speaking. "What's in the letter?" "The truth," he said simply, "about a man who did wrong and another who stayed silent to protect him. About how silence became a greater sin than the act itself." Her throat tightened. "Why would you take the blame?" "Because the church wasn't ready to face its own reflection," he said. "And because I thought protecting it meant protecting God." He closed the Bible, hands trembling slightly. "But God doesn't need protection. People do." Rebecca didn't reply. She could feel something changing inside her, something she hadn't felt in years, a kind of compassion that hurt. Before she left, Thomas said quietly, "If you ever find it in your heart, help me take that letter home." She turned toward him, her voice firm but shaking. "I can't promise that." "Then don't promise," he said gently. "Just pray." As she walked down the corridor, the echo of her footsteps mixed with the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. For the first time, she wasn't sure if she was walking away from guilt or toward it. That night, she whispered a short prayer before bed. The first in years. Not for herself, but for an old man who believed that forgiveness was still possible inside a place built for punishment. And somewhere between that whisper and the sound of the wind outside, Rebecca realized she was already part of his redemption, whether she wanted to be or not. The winter air slipped through the narrow cracks of the prison windows, cold enough to make the light flicker. Rebecca arrived for her night shift, the same routine as always: check vitals, clean instruments, log reports. Yet that night, everything felt heavier. Every sound echoed longer than it should. Father Thomas was weaker now. His coughs lasted longer, his breaths shorter. When she changed his IV line, he looked up and said, "You remind me of someone from my old parish. She used to bring flowers to the altar every Sunday, never for beauty, only for gratitude." Rebecca smiled faintly. "I'm not much for flowers, Father. I just try to do my job." "Sometimes," he said softly, "doing your job is the hardest way to show faith." Later that night, she walked through the quiet hallway, her ID card clinking softly against her chest. The fluorescent lights buzzed above her head. At the end of the corridor, Officer Jake Hernandez leaned against the wall, coffee in hand, watching her. "Long shift again?" he asked. "Always," she said. Jake nodded toward the infirmary. "That priest, he's on your list a lot lately. You two talking much?" "Just checkups," she replied quickly. He studied her face. "Be careful, Becca. Guys like him, they've got stories that can pull you in." She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The next day, Father Thomas asked for a favor. Something small, something dangerous. He wanted her to find out what happened to St. Ashford's Church, the place he once called home. "It was my parish," he said. "If it's still standing, that's where the letter belongs." She looked at him, torn between reason and mercy. "You know I can't just look that up here." "I know," he said. "But you have a life beyond these walls. A freedom I once mistook for grace." That evening, after her shift, she sat in her car in the empty parking lot. The snow had started falling. Her phone screen glowed faintly in the dark as she searched for the church's name. The result made her stomach drop. Scheduled for demolition next month. For a long moment, she just sat there. The heater hummed, fogging up the windshield. She imagined that letter lying unread, buried under dust, destroyed with the rest of the ruins. When she returned to work the next day, Father Thomas was asleep, his Bible resting on his chest. She gently opened it, the paper thin and worn. Between the pages, she saw the letter, folded neatly, sealed with nothing but faith. She stood there for a moment, then slipped it into her pocket before she could talk herself out of it. As she turned to leave, the sound of metal boots echoed down the hall. Officer Jake appeared at the door. His eyes fell on her hands, then on the Bible. "Everything okay, Nurse Martin?" "Yes," she said, forcing calm. "Just checking his meds." Jake lingered for a second too long, then nodded and walked away. But his look said he didn't believe her. That night, Rebecca couldn't stop trembling. Not out of guilt, but fear. Fear of what it meant to choose compassion over the rules she had built her whole life around. In her small apartment, she unfolded the letter. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. She didn't read it all, but the first line stopped her breath. "I took the blame because I believed silence could save souls, but silence only deepened the wound." She folded it back, tears burning her eyes. For the first time, she understood what he was asking of her. It wasn't about breaking rules. It was about restoring something sacred that the world had forgotten: mercy. The next morning, as the sun rose pale and cold over the prison yard, Rebecca made her choice. She would find that old church. She would bring the letter home, whatever it cost. The road to St. Ashford's was quiet that morning, the kind of silence that felt almost holy. Rebecca drove with both hands gripping the wheel, her heart thudding harder than the rain against the windshield. The letter sat in her coat pocket, folded neatly, as if it had been waiting years for this moment. The closer she got, the smaller the town became. Empty storefronts, boarded windows, a few men in heavy jackets shoveling snow. At the edge of the street, behind a chain-link fence, stood what was left of the church. The roof had collapsed on one side, and weeds climbed through the cracks of the stone steps. A red sign on the gate read, "Demolition notice, city property." She parked a block away, pulled her hood up, and walked. The lock on the side gate was rusted, easy to slip through. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old wood. Light filtered through a broken stained glass window, scattering colors across the empty pews. The altar was still there, chipped but standing. Rebecca walked slowly down the aisle. Her footsteps echoed through the hollow space. For a moment, she could almost hear voices, choirs, sermons, the laughter of children after Sunday service. The ghosts of faith still lingered in the air. She took the letter out, her fingers trembling. "Father Thomas," she whispered, "I hope this is what you meant." She placed it gently on the altar, right between two cracked candlesticks. Then she knelt. She hadn't done that in years. The words didn't come easily, but they came anyway. "God, if you're still listening, this man carried more guilt than he ever deserved. Please, let this letter find you. Let him rest." A gust of wind swept through the open doorway, brushing past her hair, lifting a few pages from the floor. It felt almost like an answer. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and turned to leave. But the creak of a wooden step behind her stopped her cold. "Becca?" Her breath caught. Officer Jake stood near the door. His uniform jacket soaked from the rain. His face was unreadable. How did you? He raised a hand. You left early. No one could find you. I figured I'd check the one place you weren't supposed to be. She didn't move. The letter was already gone from her hand, but guilt hung heavy in the air. I had to do it, she said quietly. He's dying, Jake. All he wanted was peace. He walked closer, his boots crunching on broken glass. Do you know what happens if they find out? You'll lose your license, maybe more. I know, she said, but I couldn't let him die thinking no one cared. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then his eyes moved to the altar, to the small folded paper resting under the soft light. I grew up here, he said finally. My mom used to bring me every Sunday. I thought this place was gone. It is, Rebecca said. But maybe some things don't die that easily. Jake let out a slow breath, rubbed the back of his neck, and shook his head. You didn't see me here, he said. Rebecca looked at him, eyes wide. I mean it, he said again. You go back to work, keep your head down, and whatever that letter says, let it stay between him and God. Her voice broke. Thank you. Don't thank me, he replied. I'm not doing it for you. He walked to the door, then stopped. You know, my grandmother used to say faith isn't proven by what we say, it's proven by what we risk. And then he was gone. Rebecca turned back to the altar one last time. The letter lay still, untouched, but somehow alive. Light poured through the broken window, landing directly on the spot where she had knelt. She whispered, barely audible, It's done. And for the first time in years, she felt something lift off her chest. Not joy, not relief, but peace. The kind that doesn't need words, the kind that only comes when you finally do what's right, even if no one will ever know. Outside, the first rays of sun broke through the gray clouds, spilling over the ruined church. Inside, on the altar, the letter remained, waiting to be found. Snow kept falling that afternoon, soft and soundless. Inside the prison infirmary, Father Thomas was barely conscious. His breathing came in shallow gasps. The ticking of the wall clock marked each passing second like a prayer that refused to end. Rebecca hadn't returned yet. She was still out there, somewhere, carrying the letter he had written with the last of his strength. He didn't know if she would make it. He didn't know if she'd even try. But deep down, he believed she would. Back in town, the church stood against the gray horizon, half broken but still holding on. Rebecca walked up the cracked steps, her coat soaked through, shoes sinking into snow. Every part of her wanted to turn back. But something stronger, something sacred, kept her moving forward. The door groaned as she pushed it open. The air inside was thick with dust and silence. Shards of colored glass from the shattered window scattered across the floor like fallen light. The altar still stood, scarred by time but steady, like it had been waiting for her. She approached slowly, her heart pounding. From her pocket she pulled out the letter, creased, damp from her palms. For a long time, she just stared at it. It wasn't paper anymore. It was a confession, a lifetime, a burden she'd been asked to carry. She placed it gently on the altar. Father Thomas, she whispered. It's here. The words trembled out of her, half prayer, half relief. She didn't know why she was crying. Maybe because it wasn't just his letter anymore, it was hers too. A plea for peace, for meaning, for forgiveness in a world that forgot how to give it. A draft swept through the broken window, stirring the air. The letter shifted slightly, as if something unseen had acknowledged it. Rebecca sank to her knees. The cold stone bit through her jeans, but she didn't care. If you're listening, she said softly, Please, see this. He carried someone else's sin his whole life. He tried to protect faith, but it broke him instead. If there's mercy left in this world, let him have it. For a moment, nothing. Just silence. Then the wind blew again, and the faint sound of a church bell echoed somewhere far away. One single ring. It was impossible. The bell tower had collapsed years ago, but she heard it. She knew she did. Rebecca closed her eyes, whispering a prayer she hadn't said since childhood. Not for salvation, not even for forgiveness, just for peace. When she opened them, she saw the light, thin and pale but steady, streaming through the broken stained glass, landing directly on the altar where the letter rested. It looked almost alive, the edges glowing faintly under the dust. And for the first time in years, she smiled. Outside, Officer Jake watched from a distance. He hadn't followed her to stop her. He just needed to see how far she'd go. Through the broken door, he saw her kneeling there, bathed in light. For a moment, he couldn't move. He took off his cap and whispered, "Rest easy, Father. She did it." Then he turned and walked away, the snow swallowing his footsteps. Back in the prison, Father Thomas stirred. He opened his eyes weakly, the room spinning. The nurse on duty leaned over him, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the clock. It had stopped ticking. For a second, he smiled. "It's been delivered," he murmured. And then his hand went still. Rebecca drove back in silence, her heart heavy but calm. She didn't know if anyone would ever read that letter. She didn't know if the church would care or if the world would understand. But she knew this. One man's truth had finally found its way home. She parked outside her apartment, sat in the car for a long while, and whispered to herself, "Forgive not for heaven, but for peace." The words hung in the air like a promise, carried on the wind toward a small, broken church that still refused to die. The morning after, the prison was unusually still. A thin fog hung over the yard, softening the razor wire and dulling the clang of metal gates. In the infirmary, Father Thomas lay motionless, his Bible resting over his chest. The letter was gone. His breathing had stopped sometime before dawn. Rebecca stood by the bed, her gloves still on, but her hands trembling. She had seen death before, but not like this. Not peaceful, not gentle. There was no struggle in his face, only calm, like someone who had finally finished a long confession. The chaplain came to say a short prayer, but Rebecca didn't move. When everyone left, she sat beside him for a while. "You made it home, didn't you?" she whispered. "You really did." Later that afternoon, the prison warden signed the final report. The cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest. Simple, clean. But as Rebecca packed his few belongings into a small cardboard box, she found something tucked inside the back cover of his Bible. A photograph. It was faded, old. A younger Thomas stood beside a man in a dark suit. Both wore the same cross around their necks. On the back of the photo were just 4 words, written in pencil. "He sinned." I stayed silent. Rebecca stared at it, her throat tightening. She understood now. The letter wasn't just for God. It was for the truth he couldn't say out loud. 2 days later, the letter was found. During the demolition inspection, a construction worker discovered it on the altar, still dry, untouched by dust or rain. The city turned it over to the local diocese. Within hours, it reached Bishop O'Rourke, the man who had once served beside Thomas Kelly. He sat in his office, reading each word in silence. The letter began with confession and ended with forgiveness. It told of a sin the church had buried, of a man who carried another's guilt to protect an institution he loved more than himself. When he finished, the bishop closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he wept. Not for the scandal, not for the loss of reputation, but for what his silence had cost. He whispered the same line Thomas had written at the end. "Forgive not for heaven, but for peace." He called his secretary. "Cancel the demolition," he said quietly. "That church will stand." Meanwhile, Rebecca received a letter in the mail, a plain white envelope with the church's seal. Inside was a short note, signed by the bishop himself. "Nurse Martin, your act of compassion reminded us what mercy truly means. The church will be rebuilt in Father Thomas's memory. His letter will remain on the altar as a testament to faith and forgiveness. May peace follow you as it followed him." She folded the letter carefully, holding it against her chest. For a moment, she closed her eyes and let herself breathe. That evening, she drove back to St. Ashford's. The demolition crews were gone. Instead, a few volunteers were cleaning the broken glass, sweeping dust from the pews. The air felt lighter. On the altar, inside a small glass frame, lay the letter, its edges slightly curled, but still whole. Rebecca stood there quietly. No words, no prayers, just gratitude. "He didn't die in disgrace," she whispered. "He died in grace." As the sun began to set, the light through the stained glass turned gold. Dust floated in the air like tiny halos. The bell above the church, restored just enough to work again, rang once, clear, steady, alive. Back at the prison, Jake Hernandez walked his nightly round. When he passed the infirmary, he paused. On the table where Father Thomas used to sit, the clock that had always ticked in that cold room now stood still at 3:17. He smiled faintly. "Guess time stopped where it should," he murmured. And somewhere between that silent clock and the sound of the bell from miles away, the two stories met, the living and the departed, the guilty and the forgiven, the ones who prayed and the ones who finally learned how. For Rebecca, it wasn't just the end of a promise. It was the beginning of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. And though no one else would ever know the whole story, she would always remember his last words, the ones that changed both their lives. "Forgive not for heaven, but for peace." Months later, spring came quietly to St. Ashford's. The scaffolding was gone. The broken windows had been replaced with new stained glass, soft blues and amber golds that turned the morning sun into something holy again. The air smelled of paint and lilies. Birds nested in the rafters where rain used to fall. On the first Sunday after the restoration, a small crowd gathered inside. They weren't parishioners, not really. Just townspeople, old workers, a few guards from the prison, and one young nurse who sat in the last pew, hands folded on her lap. Bishop O'Rourke stepped up to the altar, his voice low but steady. "Today, we reopen this church not as a monument," he said, "but as a reminder that truth and mercy are never enemies." Behind him, framed under glass, rested Father Thomas's letter. The paper had yellowed slightly, but the handwriting was clear, each line a wound and a prayer. Beneath it, a small brass plate bore the words, "Forgive not for heaven, but for peace." When the bishop finished, the choir began a simple hymn. Rebecca didn't sing. She only listened, her eyes fixed on the letter. In her mind, she could still see him, his trembling hands, the soft way he smiled when he talked about grace. After the service, people lingered to look at the letter. Some cried quietly, Others just stood in silence, as if waiting for forgiveness to touch them too. A woman whispered, "I didn't even know priests could feel that much guilt." Another replied, "Maybe that's why it's real." Outside, the sun was bright, warm against Rebecca's face. Jake was there, leaning against his car, coffee in hand. He smiled when he saw her. "Looks different now," he said. "It does," she replied, almost like it never fell apart. He nodded. "Funny thing about faith. It rebuilds itself if you give it half a chance." They stood there for a while, not talking, just watching the light spill through the open doors of the church. The world felt softer, somehow lighter. Later that evening, Rebecca visited the small cemetery behind the chapel. A new headstone had been placed there, simple, unadorned. Father Thomas Kelly, 1957, 2023. He carried silence, but left peace. She knelt and placed a single white lily on the grass. "You were right," she whispered. "Forgiveness doesn't belong to heaven. It belongs here, where people can see it." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the faint sound of the bell from the tower. One long, clear note drifted across the yard. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her. Driving home, she thought about everything that had happened. The risk, the fear, the letter that almost disappeared. None of it made sense on paper, but in her heart it did. Mercy wasn't about winning or losing. It was about freeing yourself from the weight of what can't be undone. That night, she wrote in her journal for the first time in years. "I once met a man who believed God still listened to broken people. He was right. Maybe the only way to heal this world is to forgive what it did to you, even if no one ever says sorry." She closed the book, turned off the light, and for the first time in a long time, slept without dreams. Outside, the moon hung over the restored church, silver against the dark sky. Through the stained glass, a single candle flickered beside the framed letter. The words glowed faintly in the quiet sanctuary. "Forgive not for heaven, but for peace." And somewhere, in that small town forgotten by most, forgiveness lived, not as a sermon, not as a miracle, but as something ordinary and eternal.